The plate hit the table with a harsh clatter, the noise echoing in the small diner and jolting Martha out of her quiet thoughts. "Here you go, lady," the waitress muttered, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Enjoy your meal or whatever." She spun on her heel, her ponytail bouncing as she strode back toward the counter, not bothering to glance back at Martha. Martha sat there for a moment, frozen by the interaction. She looked down at the plate in front of her, a soggy sandwich haphazardly thrown together, with wilted lettuce peeking out from between two pieces of unevenly sliced bread. It was a simple order, a sandwich and a glass of water. Nothing fancy, nothing that should have warranted this kind of disdain. But the way it had been served, with an air of contempt, felt like an intentional insult. Around her, quiet laughter bubbled up from a few nearby tables. "Can you believe that?" a man at the counter said to his companion, his voice just loud enough to ensure Martha could hear. "She's way too entitled to be working here." His words weren't aimed at Martha, but they stung all the same. Her cheeks flushed as she gripped her napkin tightly, trying to focus her attention on the sandwich instead of the judgmental stares she felt burning into her from across the room. The diner had always been one of Martha's favorite places, a little slice of comfort in her otherwise quiet life. The friendly chatter of the staff, the cheerful clinking of dishes, and the familiar hum of conversations had made it a sanctuary of sorts. But today, the air felt different. It was heavier, tenser, like the weight of unspoken frustrations had settled into every corner of the room. The waitress, in particular, seemed to carry that tension in every movement. Her steps were hurried and sharp, her interactions brusque, and her face betrayed an exhaustion that went far beyond physical tiredness. Martha sighed, her gaze drifting toward the counter where the waitress was now engaged in an animated, irritated conversation with another customer. She couldn't help but wonder what had caused this behavior. The waitress was young, probably in her early 20s, and had the look of someone carrying burdens too heavy for her years. Her posture was defensive, her gestures exaggerated, as though she was trying to shield herself from an invisible attack. Martha's first instinct was to speak up, to ask for a manager and demand an explanation. The interaction had left her feeling humiliated, as though she'd done something wrong simply by existing. But as she opened her mouth to call out, she hesitated. A small voice in the back of her mind reminded her that everyone had bad days, and perhaps this was just one of those for the waitress. Maybe she was dealing with something far more complicated than a busy shift. Maybe the sharpness in her voice wasn't meant for Martha at all, but was simply the overflow of struggles she couldn't contain. Still, the hurt lingered. Martha looked down at her trembling hands, folding them tightly in her lap to stop the shaking. It wasn't anger that made her hands tremble. It was something deeper, an ache she couldn't quite name. She had felt it before, creeping in during quiet moments, a weight that settled in her chest like a stone. It was loneliness, perhaps, or the realization that life had become smaller and quieter as the years went by. Whatever it was, it made the interaction feel heavier, like it was more than just a rude encounter. It was a reminder of how invisible she often felt. She took a deep breath, trying to shake the feeling, and glanced around the diner. Most of the other customers had gone back to their meals, their brief interest in her discomfort fading. The man at the counter and his companion were still talking in low voices, their occasional glances making her feel like a spectacle. Martha looked down at her plate again, the sandwich now entirely unappealing. She considered just leaving, walking out without eating, but something held her in place. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the quiet hope that things might still turn around. The soft chime of the diner's door opening broke her train of thought. Martha glanced up instinctively and saw a man stepping inside. He moved with a quiet confidence, his tall frame and dark hair immediately catching her attention. He was dressed simply, jeans and a plain jacket, but there was an air about him, a calmness that seemed to command the space. As he walked further into the room, the usual buzz of the diner seemed to quiet slightly, as though his presence shifted the energy. He paused near the counter, his gaze sweeping over the room. When his eyes landed on Martha, he stopped. There was something in his expression, curiosity, perhaps, or recognition. Martha blinked, unsure why her heart gave a small, unexpected flutter. She didn't know this man. but something about the way he looked at her made her feel seen. "Excuse me," he said, his voice warm and steady as he approached her table. "Is this seat taken?" Martha hesitated, glancing at the empty chair across from her. "No," she replied after a moment, her voice quieter than she intended. "You're welcome to sit." The man nodded in thanks and pulled out the chair, lowering himself into it with an ease that put her slightly more at ease. He didn't say anything right away, simply sitting across from her with a quiet presence that was oddly comforting. Martha found herself relaxing slightly, though she couldn't explain why. After a few moments, he spoke again. "That waitress," he said, nodding subtly toward the counter where the young woman was now wiping it down with sharp, jerky movements. "She was rude to you." Martha's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes," she admitted softly, though the memory of the interaction still stung. "I'm not sure why." The man studied her for a moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes people lash out because they're carrying something heavy," he said. "It doesn't excuse their behavior, but it might explain it." Martha considered his words. She had thought the same thing earlier, but hadn't allowed herself to fully believe it. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but it doesn't make it easier." "No, it doesn't," he agreed. "But kindness has a way of lightening the load, even when it feels like it goes unnoticed." Martha looked at him, his words settling in her mind like a balm to an unseen wound. She didn't know why, but she felt herself nodding, a small part of her believing he was right. "It's hard, though," she said, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "Being kind when it feels like no one cares." The man's gaze softened, and he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "People care more than you think," he said, "and sometimes the person who needs kindness the most is the one giving it." His words hit her harder than she expected. Before she could respond, the waitress approached their table, her posture stiff and uncertain. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone softer now, almost hesitant. Martha blinked, surprised by the shift in her demeanor. "It's fine," she said after a moment, glancing at the man across from her. He gave the waitress a small, encouraging nod, his expression kind but firm. The waitress hesitated, then said, "I'm sorry for earlier." Her voice trembled slightly, as though the apology cost her something. Martha's heart softened. "It's okay," she said gently. "We all have bad days." The waitress nodded and walked back to the counter, her movements less rigid. Martha turned back to the man, a question forming on her lips. "Who are you?" she asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. He smiled faintly, a glimmer of something unspoken in his eyes. "Just someone passing through," he said, "but sometimes passing through is enough." And with that, he stood, leaving Martha with more questions than answers, but a heart that felt just a little lighter. The soft chime of the diner's door rang out, momentarily breaking Martha's spiraling thoughts. She glanced up instinctively and saw him, tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding a calm confidence that was impossible to ignore. He was dressed simply, in a dark jacket and worn jeans, his hair slightly tousled as if the wind had just tussled through it. Yet, there was an air about him, something unspoken and profound. He carried himself like a man who had seen the world's joys and sorrows and learned to hold both in quiet balance. For a fleeting moment, Martha thought she recognized him. It wasn't his face, not exactly, but the way he moved. There was a gentle assurance in his stride, like he was someone who could walk into a storm and emerge unshaken. Her eyes lingered as he scanned the room, taking everything in with a calm, measured gaze. And then, to her astonishment, his eyes met hers and softened. Before she could process it, he began walking toward her table. The world around them seemed to dim, the chatter and clatter of the diner fading into the background. Martha's heart fluttered unexpectedly as he stopped in front of her, his presence both steadying and disarming. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice low and warm, the kind of voice that made you feel seen without judgment. "Is this seat taken?" Martha blinked, caught entirely off guard. "Oh, no, not at all," she replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Please, have a seat." He gave her a small, appreciative nod and slid into the chair with a quiet ease. as though he belonged there, as though they had known each other for years instead of seconds. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He studied her with eyes that were kind yet penetrating, the kind of gaze that felt like it could see straight past the surface and into the heart of things. Martha shifted slightly under his gaze, not out of discomfort, but because it made her feel exposed in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't unpleasant, though. In fact, there was something strangely comforting about the way he looked at her, not like a stranger, but like someone who understood. That girl, Martha began hesitantly, breaking the silence and glancing toward the waitress, who was now at the counter aggressively wiping it down with exaggerated motions. Her voice trembled slightly, frustration and hurt still fresh in her tone. "She was so rude to me. I don't understand why." The man followed her gaze to the waitress, his expression calm but contemplative. His dark eyes lingered on the young woman for a moment before returning to Martha. He didn't rush to speak, as though he were carefully choosing his words. "She's carrying something," he finally said, his tone thoughtful. "You can see it in the way she moves, the way she speaks. It's not about you." "Not really." Martha frowned, not entirely sure how to respond. "But that doesn't excuse how she treated me," she said quietly, though there was a hint of doubt in her voice. "No, it doesn't," he agreed, leaning forward slightly, resting his forearms on the edge of the table. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as though he wanted his words to land gently. But sometimes, people lash out because they don't know how to deal with what's weighing on them. It doesn't make it right, but it can help to see the person behind the behavior. Martha's lips pressed together. She hadn't expected such a response. She wanted to cling to her frustration, to the indignation she'd felt when the plate was slammed down in front of her. But his words chipped away at her defenses. "She's so young," Martha murmured, her eyes drifting back to the waitress. "Too young to seem so hardened. She's probably trying to survive something you can't see," the man said gently, "the way we all do, in our own way." Martha let out a long breath, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. "I suppose I could have been kinder," she admitted, almost to herself. "But it's hard to think about kindness when someone treats you like you don't matter." The man smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting just enough to soften his serious expression. "Kindness isn't always about them," he said. "Sometimes, it's about you, about deciding who you want to be, even when it's hard." His words settled over Martha like a warm blanket, soothing but heavy with truth. She nodded slowly, the knot in her chest beginning to loosen. "That's easier said than done," she said, her voice soft but steady. "It is," he agreed, his tone carrying the weight of someone who knew that struggle intimately. "But it's worth it." For a moment, the air between them was quiet but full, charged with an unspoken understanding. Martha felt a small, unexpected sense of relief. This man, this stranger, had walked into her life at the perfect moment, and though she didn't understand why, she was grateful for it. As if on cue, the waitress hesitated near their table, her shoulders tense and her expression guarded. "Is everything okay with your meal?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost unsure. Martha glanced at the man across from her, then back at the waitress. The shift in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. There was no sarcasm this time, no biting edge. Martha saw something different in her eyes now, uncertainty, perhaps even regret. "It's fine," Martha said softly, offering a small smile. "Thank you." The waitress nodded quickly, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her apron before she turned and walked back to the counter. Martha watched her retreat, noticing how her movements seemed less sharp now, more hesitant. "She's trying," the man said, drawing Martha's attention back to him. Martha sighed, nodding. "Maybe," she said quietly. "I suppose we all are, in our own way." The man tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful, and that's what makes all the difference. For the first time that day, Martha felt a glimmer of something she hadn't in a while: hope. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, but it was there, quiet and steady, like a single flame in a dark room. She didn't know this man's name or why he had chosen to sit with her, but in that moment, she realized it didn't matter. Sometimes, the right people come into your life when you need them most, even if only for a moment. The man's expression softened, though the quiet intensity in his eyes remained fixed on her. "People often act out when they're hurting," he said gently, his voice steady but layered with understanding. "It doesn't excuse the behavior, but more often than not, it's not really about you." Martha opened her mouth to respond, but before she could form the words, her attention was pulled to the waitress. The young woman, who had carried herself with such sharpness earlier, now seemed different. Her once confident strides had become hesitant, her movements almost mechanical. She noticed the man sitting across from Martha, and her entire demeanor shifted, shoulders stiffening, eyes flickering with unease. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she made her way toward the table. "Is everything okay with your meal?" the waitress asked, her voice noticeably softer, lacking the defiance it held earlier. Martha hesitated, glancing briefly at the man across from her. His calm presence seemed to fill the space between them, grounding her thoughts. She looked back at the waitress, whose gaze had dropped to the floor. The shift in tone was undeniable. "It's fine," Martha replied, her voice measured but with a hint of resolve. The waitress lingered for a moment, as though searching for the right words. Finally, she mumbled, I'm sorry. It's been a tough day." The apology was barely audible, yet it carried a sincerity that Martha hadn't expected. The man leaned forward slightly, his posture both deliberate and reassuring. His tone, when he spoke, was steady and compassionate, yet it left no room for misunderstanding. "We all have tough days," he said, his voice low but firm. "But it's important to remember, kindness doesn't cost anything." The waitress nodded, her shoulders sagging under the weight of those words. She looked like someone who had been carrying more than her share of burdens. And though her apology had been simple, it felt like the beginning of something deeper. Without another word, she turned and walked back to the counter, her steps slower, her movements less forceful. Martha's gaze followed her, curiosity mingling with an unexpected pang of sympathy. The transformation she just witnessed, the shift from hostility to something closer to vulnerability, wasn't lost on her. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of struggles the young woman might be facing. Yet what puzzled her even more was the man across from her. How had he done it? How had he managed to shift the entire energy of the interaction with just a few words? Martha turned back to him, her eyes narrowing slightly in curiosity. "How did you do that?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mix of awe and disbelief. It's like she was a completely different person. The man smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes but carried a depth of understanding. "Sometimes, all people need is to feel seen," he said simply. "When someone's hurting, it's easy for them to lash out. But if you meet them with understanding instead of judgment, it can change everything." Martha let his words sink in, replaying the scene in her mind. It was such a small moment, a brief exchange in a crowded diner, but it had shifted something within her. "I don't know if I could have done that," she admitted after a pause. "I was too caught up in how she treated me to even think about what she might be going through." "That's the hard part," he said, leaning back slightly, his calm gaze steady on her. "It's easy to react when someone's unkind. It's harder to pause and ask yourself why they're acting that way. But that pause, it makes all the difference." Martha nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. She thought about the waitress, how sharp her words had been earlier, and how quickly her defenses had crumbled under the weight of those few simple sentences. The young woman had seemed so hardened at first, yet in reality, she had been barely holding herself together. Martha wondered how often she herself had judged people too quickly, how often she had let her own frustrations blind her to the struggles of others. The man's voice broke through her thoughts again, soft but deliberate. "The world's full of people fighting battles you'll never see. A little grace can go a long way." Martha looked up at him, her brow furrowed slightly. "You speak like someone who knows that firsthand." His faint smile returned, this time with a trace of something deeper, perhaps a memory or a scar. "Maybe," he said, his tone neither confirming nor denying her observation. "Let's just say I've learned a lot from my own mistakes." She wanted to press him, to ask what he meant, but something about his demeanor made her hold back. It wasn't that he seemed unwilling to share, it was more that he carried his stories quietly, choosing to offer pieces only when the moment called for it. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, the hum of the diner filling the space between them. Martha found herself relaxing, the tension from earlier melting away. The man's presence was grounding, almost like an anchor pulling her back to herself. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice softer now. "Thank you for stepping in. I don't think I would have handled it the way you did." He shook his head gently. "You don't have to thank me. We're all just trying to do our best, aren't we?" Martha nodded, his words settling over her like a warm blanket. She hadn't expected anything extraordinary when she walked into the diner that day, but this stranger had managed to turn what felt like a small, frustrating moment into something much larger, a quiet lesson in kindness, grace, and the power of understanding. Across the room, the waitress glanced in their direction. For the first time, her face wasn't marked by irritation or defensiveness. Instead, there was a flicker of something softer, maybe gratitude, maybe relief. Martha met her gaze briefly and offered a small, understanding smile. The young woman hesitated, then returned the smile, tentative but genuine. As Martha turned back to the man across from her, she felt a shift within herself. Maybe she didn't need all the answers. Maybe, just for today, it was enough to let go of the hurt and hold on to the kindness that had been offered to her instead. And in that quiet moment, she realized that sometimes, the smallest gestures, a gentle word, a listening ear, a moment of grace, could carry the greatest weight. As if sensing her inner turmoil, the man looked at Martha again, his eyes steady yet gentle. "I didn't mean to draw attention," he said softly, his voice carrying a calm reassurance. "But sometimes, people need a mirror to see themselves clearly." Martha's brow furrowed as she processed his words, her curiosity battling with her disbelief. "Who are you?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with a mix of awe and confusion. He hesitated, his expression calm yet thoughtful, as though considering how much to reveal. Finally, he gave a small, unassuming smile. "My name is Keanu," he replied simply, his tone humble, as if that name carried no weight at all. The air around Martha seemed to still. Her heart skipped a beat, the name resonating in her mind. It was familiar, too familiar. She stared at him, her disbelief evident. "Keanu Reeves," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, as though saying the name aloud would shatter the surreal moment. He nodded, his demeanor unchanged, his presence steady and grounded. "That's me," he confirmed, his tone modest, as if this was just another day, another encounter. Martha sat frozen, her thoughts racing. She searched his face for confirmation, and there it was, the familiar feature she had seen 100 times on screens, now sitting across from her in this unremarkable diner. She wanted to ask him 1,000 questions. Why was he here? Why had he chosen her table? What had brought him into her seemingly ordinary life? But her voice faltered under the weight of the moment. Finally, she managed a simple, heartfelt sentence. "Thank you for what you did," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "For stepping in." Keanu's expression softened, and his smile widened ever so slightly. It was the kind of smile that didn't seek to draw attention, but instead conveyed warmth and sincerity. "There's no need to thank me," he replied. "Sometimes, doing the right thing just means being there for someone when they need it most." His words carried a weight that went beyond the moment, as though he was speaking from experience. Martha found herself wondering what kind of life could instill such quiet wisdom in someone. But before she could say anything else, Keanu stood up, his movements graceful and unhurried. He reached into his pocket and placed a small, folded piece of paper on the table in front of her. "Call me when you're ready to talk," he said, his voice low but filled with meaning. The sincerity in his tone made it clear this wasn't just a passing gesture. Martha stared at the piece of paper, her mind spinning. When she looked back up, Keanu was already heading toward the door. The soft jingle of the bell above the entrance signaled his exit, leaving Martha alone with her thoughts and the note he had left behind. She unfolded the paper slowly, her hands trembling. Written in neat, unpretentious handwriting was a phone number and the simple phrase, "Call me when you're ready to talk." No explanation, no fanfare, just an open-ended invitation that felt both mysterious and deeply personal. Martha sat back in her chair, her heart racing as she tried to process what had just happened. She had walked into the diner expecting nothing more than a quiet meal and perhaps a bit of frustration over a rude waitress. Instead, she had encountered someone who seemed to see straight into her soul. Keanu Reeves, a man she had only known as an actor, a face on a screen, had stepped into her world and, with a few words and a single note, had left her feeling seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Her thoughts were interrupted as her gaze drifted toward the counter. The waitress stood there, wiping down a tray with slow, deliberate motions. She glanced at Martha briefly, her expression no longer defensive but thoughtful. The exchange from earlier seemed to have left its mark on her as well, though what it meant, Martha couldn't be sure. Martha turned her attention back to the note, her mind flooded with questions. Why had he given it to her? What did he mean by "when you're ready to talk"? And most of all, why her? She felt a mix of confusion, curiosity, and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. It was as if, in the midst of an ordinary day, she had been handed the beginning of something extraordinary. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her bag, feeling its presence like a small weight against her side. Whatever it meant, she knew one thing for certain. Her life had shifted in some small but undeniable way. It was as though the encounter had opened a door she hadn't realized was there, and now it was up to her to decide whether to walk through it. As she sat there, the sounds of the diner slowly returning to their usual rhythm, she couldn't help but feel that this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Keanu's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes, people need to see themselves through someone else's eyes. She didn't know exactly what he had seen in her, but she was beginning to suspect that this unexpected moment of connection might hold answers she hadn't even known she was looking for. And so, with a deep breath and a newfound sense of purpose, Martha made a quiet vow to herself. She would hold on to this moment, this feeling, and whatever came next, because sometimes, the smallest gestures, a shared meal, a quiet conversation, a single piece of paper, could change everything. Martha stared at the note, her hands trembling slightly as she picked it up. When she looked up again, Keanu was already at the door. He glanced back one last time, offering her a nod before stepping outside. The door closed behind him with a soft chime, leaving Martha sitting alone with a flood of questions she wasn't sure how to answer. In the days that followed, the note became a constant presence in Martha's mind. She had reread the words countless times, trying to decipher their meaning. Why had Keanu reached out to her? What did he see in her that she couldn't see in herself? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Martha made a decision. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hello, this is Keanu." Martha's breath caught in her throat. "Hi," she said softly. "It's Martha. We met at the diner." "I remember," Keanu said, his voice warm and reassuring. "How are you?" Martha hesitated, the flood of emotions catching up with her. I'm not sure," she admitted, "but I think I need help." "You took the first step by calling," Keanu replied gently. "Now, let's figure out the rest together." And in that moment, for the first time in years, Martha felt a glimmer of hope. In the weeks that followed her call to Keanu, Martha found herself stepping into a world she had long forgotten, a world where kindness, understanding, and connection held the power to heal. Keanu had invited her to a small group meeting he regularly attended, a space where people from all walks of life came together to share their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. At first, Martha was hesitant. The thought of opening up to strangers was daunting, but Keanu's gentle encouragement gave her the courage to walk through the door. What she found inside surprised her, not just the warmth of the people, but the way their stories mirrored her own in unexpected ways. She listened as others shared moments of heartbreak, resilience, and the small victories that kept them moving forward. Slowly, Martha began to speak too, her voice trembling at first but growing steadier with each passing session. Keanu wasn't always present, but his quiet support remained a constant. He would check in after meetings, sometimes with a simple text, "How are you feeling today?" Other times, he'd send her links to resources or inspiring stories he thought might resonate with her. It was never overwhelming, just enough to remind her that someone believed in her. One day, as she sat in her tiny apartment flipping through an old journal, Martha came across a list she had written years ago, dreams and goals she had abandoned when life became too heavy. She stared at it for a long time, a flicker of determination igniting in her chest. With trembling hands, she picked up a pen and added a new entry to the list: "Help others find their hope, just as someone helped me." From that moment on, Martha's journey took on a new purpose. She began volunteering at a local community center, mentoring young women who were struggling to find their footing. She shared her story not to dwell on the pain, but to show that even in the darkest moments, light could be found. As for Keanu, he remained in the background, a steady presence, a quiet cheerleader. One evening, as they shared a coffee after a meeting, Martha turned to him and said, "I never thought I'd be here. Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't." Keanu smiled, his eyes warm and full of sincerity. "You did the hard work, Martha. I just reminded you of what was already inside." Martha carried his words with her, a constant reminder of the power of compassion and the ripple effect a single act of kindness could create. And as she continued to build her life, one step at a time, she knew that her story wasn't just hers. It was a beacon for others still searching for their own glimmer of hope.